2020. Please join me for the flag salute. Fresh from his CERT training. I saw him an hour ago at the CERT training. He's going to go back, so if there's an earthquake later today, we know that John will help us out. And to the Woodburn Planning Commission, Maria Elena Guerra.
Mr. Mayor, I make a motion that we appoint John Zobrist to position 2 of the Woodburn Budget Committee, and that we appoint Maria Elena Guerra, position number 1, Woodburn Planning Commission. Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right. We are proud to have the Marion County Health Promotion and Prevention Team here to present to us this evening.
Hi. It's nice to be with you all tonight. Margaret's going to get our PowerPoint up and running, so I'll just take a second to introduce ourselves. Now, how much do I need to talk in here? Is it
Yeah, I think a lot.
Okay.
Just to pick it up.
Just making sure as I'm
Facebook
looking,
Live.
not looking, I'll have to look at all of you over here on this side. Anyway, my name is Susan McLaughlin. It's nice to be here tonight. I'm a substance abuse prevention specialist, and currently I'm the prevention and health promotion team supervisor for Marion County Health and Human Services. So we are making our rounds to city councils around Marion County just to give you an idea of what we do as a team, some of the work we've been doing over the last year to do some community assessment, specifically around tobacco and substance use, and then to just remind you that we're here to help with policy development or other issues for training in your personal life, in your business, in your civic life. We are here to help you as your prevention specialist. So that's our goal tonight, to take about 15 minutes of your time. Are we getting close?
We're getting close. I don't know why I can't get the...
It's like you were there for a minute, but then.
Sorry.
That's okay. So while they're trying to get the official PowerPoint up, you know, the first slide is really who the heck are we? So I kind of have told you who I am. Both myself and Margaret's information are there on the bottom. Last year, we spent almost all of 2019 doing a community assessment, and so I'm going to tell you a little bit about some of the assessment process we went through, so you can get just a beginning to understand the kind of data and things we have to offer for you. So in 2019, okay, well, she's going to fiddle with that, with our apologies.
We'll focus on you.
Technology is awesome until it's not, right? Everybody can relate to this, I hope, so you'll kind of laugh along with us. I think she's probably started it on the show
The
instead
autopilot.
of manual. Okay, so the county as a whole does something we call the CHA, or the Community Health Assessment. Hospital systems, all 3 of our hospital systems have to complete a CHA, and the county is too, and those are mandated through statute. So we work as a collaborative group in Marion County to do all of that data assessment and collection together to produce a huge document full of indicators for our county. So together with Santiam Hospital in Salem, Salem Health, or Santiam Hospitals in Staten, sorry, and Silverton Hospital, along with Kaiser Permanente, then we produce this huge document that has probably 200 indicators on it that looks at the overall community health. from that document, we prioritize as a community what we're going to work on. So part of what we're here today to talk about is, for the first time ever, substance use, substance misuse is one of the priorities that our huge collaborative effort identified as one of the top 3 priorities for us to be working on in our communities to make them healthier, happier, safe places to live, grow, work, and play. So as the person who's been doing substance abuse prevention in this county for 15 years, it feels really good that we have some acknowledgement that whether we're talking about teen pregnancy or whether we're talking about homelessness, any of the problems you probably face here at council, substance use and alcohol use are often a contributing factor. So if we can really get at the root causes of preventing substance misuse, some of our other very costly, both socially and personally, and dollars and cents to our community, some of those things should get better. So that's where we are. We've done this community health assessment. In addition to that, our team spent a year with a community coalition of over 100 stakeholders from all over the county and from lots of different sectors, lots of walks of life, teachers, law enforcement, community service programs, of course, prevention specialists, looking at specifically substance use across the lifespan. So we dug in really deep there and have some results there too that we'd love to come and do. You know, it would take me an hour to really talk about what the data showed us, but we were able to make some priorities even out of that as well. So the county as a whole across the programs are looking at substance use, and then we've taken a really deep look at that in our team to see exactly where problems are happening, what our community feels is the most concerning priorities there, and what we can really do something about. And now we're starting the process of reaching out and creating some methods for us to collectively work together. So from you guys at the end, we're going to ask you to take a quick survey for us, really let us know what you think your problems here in this community are, so that we can bring our data and the resources we have to really help you problem solve through that. Okay, so keep that in mind. One of the other assessments that happened last year is called the Tobacco and Alcohol Retail Assessment. So we've been looking and working on tobacco for, 30 years, probably? How many of you remember back when you could smoke in restaurants and airplanes and there wasn't a lot of regulation? So we've come a long way, but there's still quite a bit of room for us to do more work around tobacco as well. So we're still out there assessing that and looking at it as well. Okay. So what I want to share with you when we get to it next, slide number 3, is going to talk about those priorities that were identified. So I'm tempted to wait a little bit, but what if we don't get that together? So off the cuff, the community health assessment of that CHA, the 3 priorities, one of them I mentioned was what? Who was listening? Substance abuse.
Right.
Oh, you didn't know I was going to quiz you, right?
Misuse?
Yeah, substance misuse in our community. And that's a wide umbrella, right? So we can work under a lot of different subcategories of that. Behavioral health supports were the other one. So we're recognizing it's not only mental health, but behavioral health, again, across the lifespan is a priority in our community. And then the third one is housing. So none of those are terribly surprising, but that should be the priorities that our hospital systems, anyone who's involved in public health, which is everyone, I will tell you, should be focusing on that. So for the next 4 to 5 years, that's going to be our guiding principles that we're working on in our communities. When we dug down deep for substance use prevention, when we started trying to say, okay, we're going to inform this work group that's going to work on substance use issues, we found out from our community that underage drinking is still a big deal and still a problem. Okay? Alcohol by far was still the substance of most misuse and greatest latitude across all of the social problems. So even though we can look at our data and say substance use, including alcohol use in general, has decreased over time, and again, I can bring a bigger data presentation and wow you with all my facts and charts. But it is getting better over time. However, it's still involved in quite a bit of our social issues. Of course, we have a lot of money and attention and time going into methamphetamine and opioid misuse. And those are, so when we say alcohol is the priority for the community, followed by tobacco, marijuana, and vaping, it's still kind of those what we used to consider gateway drugs that are still causing the farthest, largest number of problems. It's not that opioids are not an issue, or methamphetamine, because when we look at law enforcement or through the DA's lens, they may think something different, but when we look at numbers of people affected across the lifespan, alcohol, tobacco, and then that vaping is coming right along. And I heard someone even today as we walked in say, hey, vaping is a big deal for our young people. So that might be something that we can help you take a look at as well. Okay? So those were our priorities. And then the third assessment that we looked at was through the tobacco and alcohol retail assessment. And Margaret's going to tell you a few things that we found that are still out there about alcohol. Eric, you've worked in Woodburn for a long time looking at some of those things going on in the environment. How do we advertise to kids? How do we attract them to the products when it's related to tobacco or alcohol? And some of those things are still out there of concern. And then we want to take what we know from our successful tobacco reduction and successful alcohol reduction and then apply those same principles to what do we see about how kids are getting attracted to vaping products, to kratom, to some of the other up-and-coming things that we're seeing. So Margaret's going to tell you a little bit about what we found now through the tobacco and alcohol advertising assessment.
Okay, thank you, Susan. When we did this assessment, we went to, at random, 221 retailers in Marion County, and we assessed 51 of those, including here, I think there was at least 2 in Woodburn, more than two in Woodburn. And what we have found is that it's very interesting. Out of all the retailers, no surprise, they allow youth in their stores. There's no age limit to letting people into grocery stores, retail stores that sell tobacco products and alcohol, unless it's specifically an OLCC liquor store only. 7 out of the 10 retailers advertise tobacco or e-cigarettes inside the store. 43% sold tobacco and alcohol products within toys, next to toys, near candy, ice cream. Some of the other things that we found is 1 out of 4 of the stores offered discounts. They also sell small little cigars that are less than $1 that makes it really attractive to youth because they're very inexpensive. So there's a cadre of ways that there's marketing and advertisements specifically targeting youth in our environment. But with that said, that's the bad news. But the good news is there's things that we can do as a community, some resources that we have. We can look at policies. We can also just look at really what the community wants and what we want from, what we want our youth to be exposed to. So there's different things that we can look at in that way. And then that's the same with alcohol in that the advertising is sometimes it's very cultural specific and it'll target specific communities like it does here in Woodburn, definitely.
All right, so we have a lot of assessment. So our next step in our process, we do use evidence-based practice for how we plan prevention programmings. What we want to do is get upstream, and upstream and prevention means before the problem develops, before people experience the risky behavior, we want to do something in there to either delay them starting or trying it. When we talk about youth and alcohol or vaping, okay, we want them to delay till they're older, till their brain is developed a little bit better. And we want to prevent them from getting in a place where when they start using it, that they get into an addictive cycle and start to have some of those negative impacts. So we can do a lot of that work through policy work. We can do a lot of it through collective impact. What we would like to ask you today is just to participate with us. to know that we have lots of resources for you. We could come back, for example, if you're really worried about vaping, you're really worried about marijuana, we can do a whole presentation for you on any of the substances out there. We can share more data that's more specific based on what you're looking for. And then what we want is some feedback from you. So as we mentioned, you're going to get a link eventually, probably tomorrow in an email, to a survey. This is a repeat of a survey that your city council took, we think about 5 years ago, somewhere in that range. It's called the Jurisdictional Readiness Survey. So it's going to ask you just a few questions. It shouldn't take you more than about 10 minutes to complete. What we're looking for in that is for you to tell us what are the concerns in Woodburn. How can we narrow down what you're interested in us helping you with, what the community's concerned about, so that when we come back and work with you, if you invite us to, that we really know what's of interest to you in your local condition. Because we're not interested in doing something countywide because all our communities are very different. So that's kind of the ask, that you participate in our survey and have us come back and know that we're out there and we can be here for you if something comes up in your school district. We just talked to the chief there about some things going on with law enforcement. You know, we're around, we can help you. We have a lot to offer. And we have capacity for the first time in a long time to be out here kind of trying to drum up some business and remind people that we're here. So, sorry the PowerPoint was not very effective.
We're sorry.
Technology is wonderful till it's not, is kind of my mantra as I've been a facilitator for a lot of years. Always something. We have some handouts that you're going to get that are talking about a little bit more facts on that CHA and some of the things that were found in the Terra. So I'm going to kind of close up. If anyone has questions, we're happy to stay and answer questions, but we'd really love to hear back from you in the next month or two and how we can really specifically help Woodburn. Make sense?
Yep.
Yes.
Questions?
Questions?
Are you presenting to the school board?
We have not made the rounds of school boards at this point. That's something I've done in the past when I had specific programming that I was interested in rolling out to schools. We're currently working more at the population or the environmental position, right? So when we work in schools, if they'll ask us to do something specific, but we're really looking at population-based strategies, which is usually policy work, right? So we're really thrilled when you pass smoke-free parks, by the way. So thank you for that. That makes a huge difference. You may not see it, but in the next 10 or 15 or 20 years, those young people who were not exposed to smoking or, it's going to make a difference in the long run. And that's what we mean by upstream. We're really making those differences early on, that we can't necessarily measure what people decide not to do in the next 20 years, but we know that those impacts will be there.
I have a question so you talked about misuse, behavioral health, and housing.
Mm-hmm.
So housing is the things we've talked back and forth
Right.
a lot about over the last year. So could you comment a little bit about the relationship between people having stable housing and then misuse of
And
drugs?
substance use?
Mm-hmm.
A lot of the data that we have to support, how many of you, if I said, is homelessness impacted by alcohol, how many would say yes? Are we pretty sure?
Yeah.
How do we know that, right? We don't have very good ways to measure that, as far as we have surveyed every homeless person and 82% of them have told us, right? Some of that's anecdotal. However, when you talk to people who work with homeless populations or within housing programs, they will very readily tell you how often they see alcohol or substance misuse having an impact on somebody's home situation. So there's definitely some hand-in-hand things that go along with that. Same with the behavioral health and mental health, right? It's hard to really separate them out. What we do know is that if we're doing something to work on the risk factors for one of the issues, we're having positive ripples and impacts on the other as well.
Mm-hmm. So kind of answering both.
Yeah.
I
Yeah.
drink, I'm homeless, or I'm in this situation because I'm drinking, or I'm drinking because I'm in this situation.
Yeah, sometimes I think it's very rarely that simple, but, because there are so many different factors going into that equation. But certainly, oftentimes people who are having a hard time coping turn to substance use. Once they're involved with that very deeply, then it becomes hard to maintain a job or a family life or some other structures that need to be in place that give us that shelter and that sense of home.
Right.
And then once we lose that, it's really hard to get it back. So one of the upstream things for homelessness is to keep people housed. So to recognize really early when they're at risk of losing their housing or not being able to pay that rent this month and going to be transitioning into their car, if we can just do something at that touch point or that pain point to keep them housed for that month or two until they can get back on their feet, that can make a huge impact in the long run. And sometimes that's helping them get into treatment. Sometimes that's giving them that $50 check that will make that last bit of their rent so they can just get by until the new job starts, So it's not as...
Right. We've come to recognize
Yeah.
that it's much more complicated.
It's
than-
very
than my-
complicated, yeah. And I think you don't realize how complicated it is till you are trying to help solve it. And then it's like, wow. But there are these smaller things we can do that we know wrap around and collectively help upstream.
Is there a difference between misuse and abuse? 'Cause
Well,
you-
misuse and abuse are just, misuse is a more PC term or a modern term. It's kind of like sexually transmitted disease or sexually transmitted infection. It's just sort of the way we talk about it in the day. Misuse can encompass more behaviors than abuse because many people who, let's say, for example, we're talking about prescription drugs. I got it from my husband. I'm using it the way it's directed. It was for him. Well, that's misuse because it's not my prescription. Am I abusing it? Maybe not. So people have these rationalizations around language, and I think misuse is an attempt to describe more behavior that is risky when it comes to substances.
So I don't need to change my whole way of thinking then?
I don't think so.
Okay, good.
No. And, I've been doing substance abuse prevention and things for almost 30 years, and the way we talk about it and the nomenclature changes. But the spectrum of behavior that leads to, from legal or responsible or once in a while use all the way through to depths of some pretty horrible consequences in addiction. That has not changed, just the names that we put on the various steps
I do
along
have
the
a
way.
question. Did you want to go first?
No, I don't have a question.
The issues that you touch on are issues that we have discussed at length as a council. So if we were to respond to your survey and make you aware, acquaint you with the issues that we've discussed ourselves, and that makes it into your body of knowledge, where I'm at a loss to understand how to use your services is, what do you do at that point to help us deal with the issues that we have identified for you? Do you have any enforcement authority?
No, we're not an enforcement body. We would be able to advise you on policy. The questions you're going to get from us are primarily tobacco and substance use, because that's sort of our expertise. If you're interested on working collectively on housing or behavioral health supports, we have other coalitions that are out doing work around that, and we would invite you to join that. However, what we'll do with the information is just take a look at it and say, well, they're identifying X, Y, and Z as problem issues or issues of concern. We have this data to contribute to that, so we can probably back it up, or we can help you really look at, okay, this is the identified problem. What are some evidence-based practices that we know can make a positive impact here? Sometimes we can come with some dollars or some program staff time. Sometimes we can help write grants for you. Often we can provide model policies or just some ideas. So I think we could help with some ideas, bring some expertise to the table.
Well, let me pose an example. For instance, if we were to identify the fact that we believe we have a number of retailers within our city that are advertising alcohol and cigarettes and vaping to young people. Would you have the power to be able to come back to us and say, yes, that is occurring, and you should be able to shut them down.
What we could probably
how,
do
how
is,
would you get around the OLCC?
well, you have to involve the OLCC, for one, because we are not the enforcement body.
You know they
However,
have the final authority.
pardon me?
You know they have the final authority
Yeah.
on whether or not somebody stays open. So I'm wondering how we can use the benefit of your expertise to make something like that happen.
I think the way the process should work is it's a community effort. So what we can do is we can do an environmental scan, we could help with some studies of the problem, bring the data forward, and then help the community make a case for whatever the problem was that you saw. In the past, we've done law enforcement trainings, we've organized outings with law enforcement where they go to places that are purportedly selling to minors and done some minor decoy operations. I mean, there's a lot of different ways to get around it. And I'd love to come back and really present some ideas and some policy that we know work for the specific problem, because there's a whole cadre of evidence around what kind of initiatives work. Some of them are pretty hard to execute, or they cost a lot of money or a lot of resources in time. Some of the other problems that we typically see is sometimes, you know, when we call OLCC about things, they say that's a local law enforcement issue. Local law enforcement may not have the capacity to deal with some of the seemingly minor problems that add up to a collective big problem, right? So I can't give you 100% yes, we'll get somewhere, but we sure would love to try to help you. But it would be a community effort that we would specialize in. We can do focus groups, we can do town halls for you, we can educate the community, raise the readiness for the community to accept that this is a problem in our community, this is how we know it's a problem, this is what we're gonna do about it, this is how we know that's going to work, and so let's all work together to get at that problem.
Thank you.
I have a question. Are you aware that we're already trying to move forward with a group called Love Inc., where we're trying to coordinate all the helpers in Marion County to be at one location to help people out? I think that's probably could be where you'd be most useful to the community, is to
Did you
base
say it was
yourselves
called
there.
Loving?
Love Inc.
Love Inc., okay. Yes, I know about Love Inc., yeah, I've heard of that.
Yes, we're looking for
Did
a-
that take the
we're a
place of
resource
some of
center.
the
Well-
sit teams? The,
In some ways,
yeah.
yeah.
But what we're trying to bring together is different community supports to one location, so the people that we're trying to help out, the homeless, the drug misusers, so they know where to go. And I think that would be something that you might want to get your teeth into, because that sounds like somewhere that you'd be very helpful to us
well,
as
we're
a community.
upstream, so prevention is, there's a spectrum, okay? So we're trying to work upstream from that to put things in place so people are not needing those resources. There are other people within the health department system that work on interventions or actually providing services to clients. And so I know I have heard about the centralized effort in Woodburn. It's not my direct work. And so I know there are people who have been invited to join that. I'd be happy to get back in touch with you and touch base more on a one-on-one and see how I can make a better
just
connection
see
for you.
Functionally, that would be the most helpful to us as a community, because it sounds like you have a lot of resources, already knowledge, and everything's right there at hand, that you could help out the other groups,
Yeah.
you know, and guide, because you're just way beyond. I'm not quite sure how you can help us.
Well,
honestly.
I think, like, kind of jumping in, I think that what they're trying to do is just give us the information. So us as city councilors, we're aware about what's going on and how we can, you know, as public officials, you know, make a difference and make it more of a trying to fix the root of the problem, or kind of like get kind of the bull by the horns instead of kind of like guiding it where to go. I think that's what they're trying to do.
I just wanted to add that when Council Carney, you were mentioning like different things that we could do, is that, you know, we were going to come we're going to a lot of other different jurisdictions. And like Susan was saying, every jurisdiction, every community is different. And one of the things that we could also do is, when we're looking at policies, is that we find out your interest, what your main concerns are, and then we are available to come back with some data, with some evidence-based policies. So, for instance, when we looked at, you were talking about alcohol and retail, the OLC is involved in the alcohol part, and the Oregon Health Authority is involved in the tobacco part. For instance, you don't need a license to sell tobacco, but you do alcohol. So, if you wanted to work on something like that, we could help with that. And then there would be consequences if, let's say, that you did sell to a minor, so there's things like that upstream approach that Susan was mentioning, that we could have a direct effect on, those policies would have an effect on enforcement. Does that make kind of sense?
It does. Thank you
Okay.
very much.
Did you guys said you surveyed 2 locations in Woodburn? Did I hear that right?
I think it was more than 2.
Yeah.
But we could tell you exactly how many. We have over 210 retailers that are somewhat known. They're not subject to licensure, so it's just where we know sell tobacco.
Right.
And then it was a randomized percentage. We had to physically visit 25% of those retailers throughout the county. So it was a randomized number. And I want to say Woodburn was 4 or 5.
Okay, so
Here,
you feel
but-
statistically your data would be applicable to Woodburn? Because if you visit,
Yeah,
I
for
do.
sure.
if you visit
Yes.
2, that's not.
And we were, and I have to say that we were housed here in Woodburn when we did the assessments, and I had personally gone to other retailers and found very comparable data.
Thank you.
So to bounce off what Mary Beth was saying, the Love Inc. has been a group that's worked downstream. That's their work, and they are establishing. This is like part of the announcements, but an upstream group that they're calling the North Marion Task Force.
Okay.
That's really at the policy level, and that's going to
We'd love
meet
be involved with that.
Tuesdays, like one Tuesday a month at 9:30, and it's the first or second Tuesday in March. And they're looking for people who are interested in those upstream kind of solutions to all the things that we're dealing with.
So yeah, we'd love to be involved with that, for sure. And sit at the table and see what we can bring to you, and if it's not us or our programs,
Right.
We are connected to quite a few different groups that we're constantly got our fingers in their cookie jar, right? So we're great connectors as well.
And I just want to thank the Marion County Health Department, under the direction of Susan. For years, they kept Woodburn Together alive until Woodburn Together morphed with Woodburn Proud with the funding. So lots of groups in Woodburn were funded, from Aztec dancers to bike helmets to, safety cars, safety seats for
The gang resistance.
summer camps.
Legion Park upgrades.
Yeah. And all those things are
And
continuing.
we're continuing with the family swimming lessons.
Yep.
We've continued that prescription for exercise program that's still going on here. And we have a specialist that's working on prescription for exercise and prescription for parks. So yeah, keeping our kids.
Yeah. And all those
stay
things are
active.
happening under the auspices of Woodburn Proud, so thanks for that support through all those years. All right, thanks for
All right, well,
visiting.
thank you for having us.
Thank you
Appreciate
very
it.
Thank you.
much.
All right, next we have a thrilling presentation about Oregon House Bills 2001 and 2003. Mr. Kerr.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I'm Chris Kerr, Community Development Director. I don't know how thrilling it'll be. A lot of fun tracking what's going on with the variety of bills going on, or that were passed last year. I really just want to make the council sort of aware of these 2 semi-controversial House bills that were passed last year. They've been getting a lot of press. I get lots of calls from the public about exactly what they mean. I just wanted to give you an overview of them and talk about what some of the anticipated next steps are for the city and some deadlines that we're going to have to work on. No actions required of you tonight. I just wanted to give you an update on where we were at. if you take a look at the February 24th memo, I was going to walk through it, and I'm happy to answer any questions when I get through and kind of go through the deadlines and some of the next steps I have. But I wrote a note to myself that says, the state still doesn't know a whole lot yet about how these are going to be implemented. And I think that's interesting because just on Friday, there was a presentation where the state, the LCD, was going forward and saying, well, these are going to be the rules, these are the requirements, here's where we're going. And they're still just fishing. They're still very much up in the air. They're not sure how to define a lot of these terms, what criteria will be required. So there's a lot of things that just aren't known yet. They're in the middle of the rule-making process, rule-writing process at this point in time. So 2 bills, House Bill 2001 and 2003. They were approved in August of last year. House Bill 2001, we call that middle housing bill. When you think of the way they're defining middle housing in this context, it means duplexes, triplexes, quadplexes, townhouses, and cottage clusters. So from their perspective, this is not major apartment buildings that stack up 4 stories high. These would be, again, 2, 3, 4, and townhomes, as well as what they call cottage clusters, which are sort of unusual. We don't have them here in the city. They're not in our code. We don't allow them today. These are these very small, almost tiny home sort of commune developments that you see where there's shared parking. There might be a shared kitchen facility sometimes. And they're these smaller, often you see them in vacation areas where there's maybe 900 square foot is the cap on these buildings. Think of a lot of ADUs on one lot.
It's like a park model,
Yeah, that's what it's sort of like.
Like a what, you said?
like a park model,
Okay.
like a baby cabin.
So that's what they call middle housing, and that's what House Bill 2001 addresses. Specifically, it says that the city will be required to allow the development of that middle housing on all areas zoned for residential uses that allow the development of a detached single-family dwelling. Now, I'm going to try to go through it, but again, they're working through the rule writing to define exactly what that means. So think of it this way. So what's going to be required, we'll talk about the deadline. It's here's the punchline. It'll be June 30th, 2022. The city must have in our code allowances to allow that to take place. We're going to have to allow middle housing in areas that allow single-family dwellings to be here. Now, what is an area? Does that mean the zoning district? They don't know that yet. And that's important. That doesn't mean that every single lot in the city has to allow quadplex. That's not been determined yet by the state. What was passed last year by the legislature says that in those areas, they're going to have to be allowed with some moderate, soft regulations that can be applied, getting to design and some siting requirements. But if they're onerous, they're going to look very harsh on it, pull the plug. If they think that it's something that's going to prohibit that development from taking place, it wouldn't be allowed. That's what it means for those areas, for all those housing types I just described, that middle housing type. What's important, a second component, this is the second bullet here, is that the legislature was clear that a duplex will be allowed on every single lot in the city that allows a single-family dwelling to be built that has a residential zoning on it. So now you're talking about what we all think of as the single-family districts where you're allowed a single-family home. You will be allowed, and there will be code provisions put in place that allow duplexes to be placed essentially every place where you can have a single-family home. There's still going to be some soft regulations about design and siting that you can put in there, but when they're finished with the rule writing, we'll get those details shortly. That's sort of what we're looking at, what we'll be up against. To give you just a feel for it, right now in our code, we allow duplexes in single-family zoning districts, but we only allow them on corner lots, and the lot has to be a little bit larger than a typical single-family home. So, in fact, there's a few going in right now. So if you have a corner lot in a typical single-family district in town, and I think it has to be a minimum of, I believe it's 10,000 square feet, but it might be 8,000. A little bit larger than typical, you can have a duplex there. And we have different standards that apply to it. They're pretty rare. We don't get that many of them.
Chris, can I ask a question?
Please.
I think people feel that this will be applicable to new development moving forward on new projects, but But couldn't also apply to existing developed neighborhoods if I wanted to purchase a property I felt was below market somewhere in town, demolish that house and put in a quadruplex to then flip as a speculative project? Would that be allowed?
Yeah,
to do?
that's a good point. That would be allowed. You
Kind
know,
of a
these-
pro-gentrification.
A lot of
kind
times
a-
we talk about, you hear in the zoning office and the planning office, we talk a lot about vested rights and non-conforming uses and structures and lots. That's not what this is about. This isn't a new zoning district and a new use that's being allowed. This is going to be applicable throughout the city with a few stipulations.
So Chris, there's two other questions that I think that, you know, I'm interested in, and if this issue arises in Woodburn, the council will hear about it too. What about the parking requirements to go from a single-family home to quadruplex now? And what about the infrastructure that's in place to support densities associated with single-family housing, and now we're tripling those, and who pays for that?
Well, I'm looking at my quote that says,
I know you
they
have no
don't know
rules,
that
but-
yet. But these are the exact questions that the technical committees right now are working on in Salem to get to and address. The infrastructure question is a good one. I'm going to talk about that in a second because that's a very a keen issue. The idea here that there might not be infrastructure in terms of water, sewer, storm, transportation in place to accommodate this additional growth, which is what you're really talking about. And I'll talk for a second about how the state's going to be addressing that and what was adopted. under House
Could you
Bill
talk about
2000.
parking though specifically? Because parking is
Well,
always a controversial
So
issue, and I
what's
think
in-
there's, yeah, go
You're
ahead.
right. So the exact language that's in the statute, it says that siting and design regulations will be allowed so that if, at some point in time, we're going to make a decision about what we want triplexes to look like in these areas that have typically only had single-family homes. What was approved says that siting and design regulations are acceptable, but, quote, no unreasonable regulations that would delay or prohibit their construction will be allowed. That's as close as I can get to what they know. So does that mean adding an off-street parking space would be something that would prohibit development or delay it? Does it mean if you put overly restrictive lot coverage requirements on it? If I make design requirements, say you have to look just like a single-family home, but good luck building a quadplex in there, would that be overly restrictive? I don't know those answers, but that's what the rule writing process is all about.
So Chris, can we talk about that for a second?
Yes.
So the rule writing process is supposed to be a public process, the ones that I've done. So who's involved in that?
So there's a variety of technical committees that are involved in crafting that. I'm happy to forward. In fact, why don't I do that? I can email you all some of the minutes, because I have a book back in my office that because I'm tracking these and seeing what kind of questions gets asked. Who are the people there? What kind of questions are they asking? And believe me, they're just starting that process.
So I guess the point I'm trying to make, or at least get to, is that it seems like a person like yourself, who's going to be directly involved in crafting our policies and procedures, is the league involved, the League of Oregon Cities, or representatives thereof, that, because I was ironically in one of these hearings last year when they were passing this law, and people like from Klamath Falls were like, wait a minute, we're not Portland. So I think the opportunity to, get a local voice is in those technical committees or in the rule writing process, because otherwise they're going to cram it down our throats.
Yeah, there's always opportunity for comment to come in, but that doesn't mean that you're on that TAC or you're on that committee. I know lots of the people that are on them. I would love to have been involved in it as well. These are pretty high-profile committees that are put together, and I'd like to tell you there's no politics involved, but I'm quite certain there's some politics involved. I also think they try to be fair about including everyone from home builder groups to homeowner groups to Thousand Friends to the league and these other groups. I think they're trying to be pretty fair about it. This is a pretty, again, it's a fairly controversial and certainly a public project that they're working on, more so than usual.
I have a question. I don't want to put words in your mouth, Chris, but am I hearing you saying that our elected legislators have passed a law, and the law has certain restrictive covenants in them, and that law is incomplete, and that they're allowing that law to now be solidified by a group of unelected and unaccountable bureaucrats?
But it's not that bad. How about this is worse? That's the way we do it in Oregon. So yeah, that's the rule writing process that they're going
Sounds
through.
like that when you say it that way.
that essentially implements what was passed by the lawmaker.
I think another definition of that could be called tyranny.
It's where the sausage is made. I mean, that's what they're going through right now. Look, I don't envy the people having to come up with that definition I just gave you and say, good, now write rules that are going to apply statewide, give me definitions, not just guidelines. I need criteria that's enforceable by the rule of law. That's hard to do. And that's what DLCD staff spearheads, and they use these other committees to get all the info they can.
You realize how convoluted this process is? I mean, they put the passing of the law before they put the wording together.
I think of it as flying the airplane as they're still putting it together. That's often how these things.
I don't doubt what you're telling me is correct.
I'm going to talk a little bit more about some of the specifics under House Bill 2001, and I'll talk about the other House bill. So again, I gave you this date. By June 30th, 2022 is when it has to be in place. Between now and then, these have to be adopted into our code to allow for those provisions to happen, for that development to take place in the areas that they're stipulating. If we don't do it, if we sit on our hands and say we're not interested in taking part in this, we'll have to meet what DLCD is going to put together a model code, and that would be the code that was applicable for someone that walks in. In other words, you can't ignore it. It's going to happen. And we'll, of course, craft it the way we want it to be done, consistent with our processes, and we'll have public hearings that go through that. We're a long ways from me working on any code work yet. But I want to talk to you about some initial steps that we're going to take now to kind of kick it off and make sure we get involved in the right way. So the legislature also allocated just for House Bill 2001, $3.5 million for technical assistance to local jurisdictions that are subject to these new, what they call, again, middle housing mandates. And that would be us. So what I'm going to be doing very shortly is I'm going to go out and I'm going to put out a pretty broad grant proposal, say that it's more of a letter of interest that we're going to be interested in securing some grants so that we can get a lot of technical advice. Some of it's engineering. I'll talk for a second about where that's important. And some of it might just be doing a better job of reaching out, getting the best information, the best technical data we can, and having consultants do it, tapping into some of that money that's going to be available for us. That gets to what I think you heard the city administrator talk about a second ago. That mandate, that requirement, again, for June 30th, 2022, there is a catch here, which is if a city has identified what are called, quote, significant deficiencies in our, whether it's water, sewer, or other infrastructure component, we can request essentially a time extension. It's called an infrastructure-based time extension request. That's the phrase. And there's grant money that's going to be available for that. Now, that's going to be a pretty technical study where we are going to have to go get a consultant. In fact, cities aren't allowed to do it. We have to hire someone on the outside to look at water, sewer, storm, et cetera, and make a determination as to whether or not, let me get the exact language, whether or not there is a significant deficiency in one of those areas that says, you know what, because we're so short on storm, we can't provide it, therefore we can't allow this, what's essentially an upzoning of property to allow more density. If you do that, you get a time extension to implement these provisions I was just talking about. How long? They haven't decided. What's significantly deficient? They haven't determined that yet. And it's not forever. It says you can't just say we're deficient, thank you very much, we don't have to do this. You also have to have a plan, and it says it must be done, quote, quickly, how you're going to address it. So it's a slight minor reprieve if you actually have a deficiency. That's how the language is written, and I expect us to go out and request a grant to look at that as well, because I have a real concern that we may have some deficiencies in some of these various areas of our infrastructure where we can't provide that. And there's a natural reason for it. Our infrastructure wasn't developed with the idea that we were going to have this additional needs and providing additional capacity in these areas. Therefore, it wouldn't surprise me if we saw some deficiencies. So we're going to look into that, and we'll use the state's money to go do that and hire some outside consultants and see what we can get from it. The last component of 2001 has to do with ADUs, accessory dwelling units. A lot of you probably remember, I think it was a hair over a year ago, we adopted accessory dwelling unit standards. We had 2 provisions in it. I've talked to you about this before as part of 2001. 2 of the restrictions, stipulations in our ADU requirements were deemed illegal under 2001. The first one says you can't have an additional off-street parking requirement for your accessory dwelling unit. And the second one says that you're not allowed to have a requirement that says you have to live on the property, owner occupancy requirement. So I've already started that process. I went to the Planning Commission, held a public hearing, done notice. And at your next meeting, I'll give you the actual change that will make us and our city legal with the 2001 requirements that were just adopted. I'm only going to be proposing those 2 changes. Everything else in the ADU shouldn't have to change. You'll see that, but again, that's just, we have to keep moving on these things. And again, we don't have a choice of not doing it.
So Chris, I don't speak for the League of Oregon Cities. I'm on the board. My opinion is my own. When this issue was kicked around, my primary concern was that the issues you raised. Let me say, I think everybody supports the goal of trying to increase available housing in the state of Oregon. That the projected need for housing is pretty scary. We're looking at population growth and just a need for market-based but yet affordable housing. So that's all good, but the cities are planned based to provide quality of life and livability issues around their planning. So parks, we care about open and green spaces. We care about street viability, financially planning for infrastructure and utilities, employment plans. We want people who move into our community to have opportunities to work in our community and not have to get on I-5 to further exacerbate I-5 congestion and traffic in the local transportation system. But by increasing densities and exempting them from these other considerations, it seems problematic from a planning standpoint, given that we've been planning in this manner for 20 years into the future, every year since 1972 or whatever it was, that this idea, if it is wildly successful, will really throw a wrench into that, and that these other aspects that we sort of value in our community about quality, stable growth, looking for investment, employment opportunities, that sort of gets tossed all to the side, and we just start stacking higher densities into places that weren't intended or designed for it 30 or 40 years ago. So that's sort of the downside. Yes, maybe we can facilitate more housing, which is good, but will it be viable and sustainable with these other foundational types of things that we plan for that aren't being considered or required to be addressed as part of that effort is the concern.
Yeah, complete agreement. It's a real concern that, the city works hard to establish that balance between everything from parks to our infrastructure to make sure we have the employment and the variety of housing that we have. May not be perfect, but again, we work long and hard at it. We do, all of our plans and codes are based on creating that balance that we're looking for here. And this throws a wrench into it.
And the other concern I'll just put out there, I think is particularly unique to Woodburn that I tried to voice, is that when we look at the neighborhoods and the particular communities in Woodburn, those with homeowners associations will not be impacted because of the covenants associated with the restrictions on their property. But other neighborhoods that tend to not have homeowners associations and maybe have a market value less than those communities that do have homeowners associations could be potentially impacted. There could be a disparate kind of impact across our community about who may be displaced to make room for higher density housing. And then will that market housing be affordable or not? And so, I think that's concerning for us, is that this is only potentially could be applicable into, communities that create, the kind of impact that we would look at and say is not equitable.
So you're saying that, Scott, if you're saying that if once we put this framework into place, that if somebody were to buy a home in Tukwila, knock it down, it's kind of an entertaining thought, and then want to build a duplex there, the HOA would override the state statute?
That's correct. But if I wanted to buy a corner of multiple houses like downtown and knock them all down to try to put in condos to flip because I can get those at a lower market rate, that would be perfectly acceptable, except it would displace people in those homes that maybe were affordable because they were because of their because of the market associated with them being older homes. So that's exactly right.
And one of the, it's pretty rare to see a stipulation in legislation that talks specifically about homeowner association CCRs. But in this case, they did. They actually put a stipulation in, as you know, that says that any CCRs, HOAs, after this is adopted, which was, I assume it was August of 2019, certainly last year. I don't know what the official effective date was. Can't prohibit these from taking place. You couldn't go out today and say, you know what, let's get out there and I'm just going to put a deed restriction on my property and our district says this won't happen. They're specifically prohibited.
And I don't
in this
know
statute.
that that's the same concern. I mean, going forward on new projects, it seems that there's some rationality to it. But when you look at existing zoning with existing homes, that's where the concern is, because what.
That doesn't seem to pass legal muster. I'm guessing that most of the legislators sitting on the panels that passed this, and ultimately the people who did pass it, a vast majority of them probably live in homeowners associations, which I'm not sure about everybody on this panel, but I do not, so.
Well, I watched this legislatively, Counselor, and really the scary numbers for the legislature is the projected need for increased housing in Oregon. I can't rattle those statistics off the cuff, but it is significant. It's like one house being built every minute or something like that to into the foreseeable future to accommodate the need, plus the crisis of affordable housing in the state of Oregon. So the goal to try to facilitate more housing is more compelling over some of maybe these other types of concerns. I think is what it felt like to me.
Thank you.
Chris, you mentioned the ADUs, and you know, I can recall a year and a half ago, when this council was going through the discussion on the ADUs, and I believe that was a classic case of bait and switch, where we were asked to welcome the ADUs into Woodburn, and all we had to do was tell them what sort of reasonable restrictions we place on them. Of course, those true reasonable restrictions were the ones that they outlawed. So we got the worst of both worlds, and it was pretty bad. But and of course the off-street parking requirement is the most offensive. But there's nothing in there that restricts the city of Woodburn from determining no parking zones. So that's
Are you talking about on streets? You're talking about parking in streets?
on streets, yeah.
There are roadways we
Yeah.
control and dictate where
We
they
still
are.
have that within our power to paint yellow lines on the street. Okay, I just wanted to be assured of that.
Let me talk about, it's not nearly as impactful, certainly in the short term, would be House Bill 2003, but I want to make you sort of aware of it. These were, again, they were adopted at the same time. This one has to do more with cities who are behind in their housing needs analysis. This gets to the housing supply question. This is really about the legislature making sure that cities are actively looking at how much housing supply they have and taking steps to make sure that housing opportunities are taking place. You might recall that we just adopted our housing needs analysis with our buildable lands inventory, some of those other components in there. We had a consultant that we did it. That was adopted in December of last year, just a few months ago. And because we did it before January 1st, it means that we, as this city, Woodburn, isn't required to update our HNA again for 8 more years. What House Bill 2003 does is it changes the way that a lot of that math is done. It changes the way that you look at what you include in terms of what's buildable land, what isn't buildable land, what kind of, they talk about housing production strategies that have to take place, reporting requirements. So they're changing really the rules and requirements for how these housing needs analysis are done. I'm glad ours is done first because it's done consistent with the way we've done them in the past. I think I like the product. I like what happened with it. It means we get a bit of a breather because we did it sort of right before the deadline. So we were essentially vested. We won't have to redo ours until 2027. And one of the new changes that's come out with that HNA is this new concept called a housing production strategy. They're working on exactly what that would be, but this is a very, very specific checklist of of strategies that cities are going to have to adopt that shows and proves, with monitoring and recording back to the state, exactly how you're producing all the housing you're supposed to be producing. So if you have an area in your city that's zoned to accommodate more medium density residential and you're not seeing any for 5 years, you must take these certain steps that you're going to have to go forward with. Again, we're 8 years out from having to look at that, but I wanted to make you aware that that's what other cities are going to be doing. We'll be able to take a look at it. And as part of the funding, there's, I think, $1 million available from that the
Chris, I have
DLCD
another
is giving.
question, because this mystifies me a little bit too. Given that these areas are owned by private parties, what types of things could the city do to leverage private property owners to develop property in the way that the government, that we would like to see it, as opposed to the way they're utilizing it to their own interests, given that they're the owners of that property?
I think what you're going to see
I mean,
are
it's a little bit of an exaggerated question, I know, but really, I don't understand how we do that. We don't control a market.
What they are talking about and discuss are this classic checklist of items actions that governments can take from a regulatory basis to make housing less expensive, which in turn encourages more redevelopment, changing off-street parking requirements, speeding up the timing and the process it takes to get something approved in a city, lessening and reducing SDCs whenever you can, property tax abatements and exemptions that you can do in certain areas, allowing more zoning. There's always this idea that by increasing the amount of density and units you can have, you make it more palatable for development interest to take place. I think those are the strategies that you're going to see them move forward with. They're going to be much stronger. And I'm looking on here, I actually have a date that's incorrect. So I have under the timelines for HB 2003, I'd written December 9th, 2020. I apologize for that. It says there's a deadline to adopt a production strategy. That's not for our city. That's more of a state's writing theirs. And they're going to in fact, they're going to work and give one city the majority of that money and work on one city is just going to, they haven't decided which one is going to be this prototypical city. And for a year, they're going to work on these strategies, see which ones work. It'll be their sort of test case, and those are going to be applicable in the future. And that's really going to test the kind of things that we were just talking about. Again, I just want to let you know that that's where we're at this point in time. I don't need any kind of action from you now, but you're going to be seeing me again because I'll be doing some more things. My immediate next steps are we're going to get your ADU language on an ordinance to next meeting. That's in response to 2001. I'm going to be pursuing some grant applications. I'm not even sure exactly how they're going to look. I just want to make sure that we can get everything we can that's in our best interest and make sure that we have access to a lot of that money as we keep tracking these things for our DLCD rep and make sure we meet any other code requirements we have to. I appreciate you taking the time. And I will forward you each, I'll send an email out so you can all get, and you can get on their email tracker. And you can see all the minutes from each of the meetings if you're so interested about their technical advisory committees and where these things are going. And it'll tell you how to get involved if you like.
Chris,
Yes.
you haven't touched on how they're going to ease the process of expanding our urban growth boundary as part of this.
Well, one thing that's interesting about it is, again, just a bit into the nitty-gritty, but one of the changes that they talk about is again, think generically here, if City X suddenly is adding and increasing the number of potential dwelling units that are going to be built in it by, let's say, 20%. Let's say it's 15%, something a little bit more reasonable. Shouldn't cities be saying, well, great, now I've added all this, I need to make accommodations, and I was thinking of expanding my UGB, but now I don't need to because I can put all that housing in these extra areas. So it really has a significant impact on whether or not cities can and need to expand their UGBs. And what the state has come down and said is that I want to say, I'm going to misquote it, I think you're only allowed a 3%, I think you're only allowed to include an increase of 3% of your housing can be included to meet this middle housing requirement. So you couldn't add 15%. You could say, I don't care what you think it's going to be. You as a city will never increase by more than 3%. So there's going to be this natural cap that they're putting on top of it so that cities aren't saying, I can wildly accommodate all this extra housing or I'm not going to get any. sorry, that's not much help. They're still working on that more, but the UGB expansion question is a really, really good one because this has a direct impact on it. It really affects everything. It's really it's a sort of a comprehensive change to the way we think about residential planning, which changes all of our infrastructure plans, TSPs, and everything else we work on.
What's the
It's significant.
consequence for not doing it?
Well, for not doing anything with House Bill 2001, say, we're just not interested. A model code will be adopted, and when someone walks in on July 1st, 2023, I'll say we don't have any rules, and they'll ignore me, and I'll have to apply the state's requirements. So we would essentially lose control of development that happens in the city,
Okay.
which we don't want.
For those of us who are here on July 2023, we'll check in to see if you
It's a
got
lot
that
of
done.
work. There's a lot of work to be done.
We're out of buttons.
Thank you.
I think,
Thanks, Chris.
Yeah, thanks, Chris. Jeez.
thank you.
I've got a couple more recent legislation here, so.
Okay, business from the public? To our city recorder, do we have any? No one? All right, so pay attention, True. Here's your mom's big moment. May I please have the city recorder read our consent agenda?
The items on the consent agenda are as follows. Woodburn City Council minutes of February 10th, 2020. 2020 OLCC renewal. Intergovernmental agreement with Marion County for building division services. And crime statistics through January.
Would anyone like to remove a consent agenda or ask a question about them?
Mr. Mayor, I move that we accept the consent agenda.
I second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. All right, we're going to move to general business and the elimination of overdue fines for most library materials. Please welcome Mr. John Hunter.
Good evening. Can you hear me now? Do I have to hold
Mr.
that?
Hunter, sometimes you have to hold the mic kind of close to your mouth.
You just have to be close to the mic.
Is that better?
Yep.
Okie dokie. So to clarify where we are and why we're here today, you may remember that last year I came to you to propose that we do a one-year pilot project to eliminate overdue fines on materials in the youth collection. So that's what we call the juvenile collection or child collection and the teen collection. We began that one-year pilot project on April 1st. We eliminated the accrual of overdue fines on those materials and also waived pre-existing fines. You may recall that my motivation in asking the council's approval to do that is because a lot of research indicates that overdue fines in particular have become an impediment for poorer families to access library services. That actually the fear of accruing fines may prevent parents from even wanting their kids to borrow materials. So with your approval, we began that waiving of overdues on youth materials and no longer accruing them, with the proviso that I would come back to you a year later, report on how things were going, and potentially propose further action. So we can look at the success of the program on a qualitative level and a quantitative level. On a qualitative level, we've had super positive word of mouth. Our library board member, Bethany Weathersby, who's very active in the homeschool community, actually solicited opinions about this on Facebook, and the word of mouth is very positive. The perception of the program is very positive. Furthermore, any of the indicators that you would look at for how the library is being used are generally positive. We've actually had a fairly good increase in the number of library card registrations, and library usage has been stable even at the same time that there are some pressures affecting library use. Digital disruption is affecting all sorts of institutions in American culture. Movie theaters are under threat. All sorts of retailers are under threat. Television networks are under threat. Redbox, is under threat. A lot of these from the same source, streaming, we have had statistical evidence that has demonstrated that a lot of folks in our Latino community in particular have been disinclined to use the library since, the election in 2016. Those numbers have come back somewhat, but we've been doing surprisingly well in spite of some of these external forces that make library operation a challenge today. And along with that, there haven't been any of the potential negative ramifications that you might have expected. We haven't seen an increase in lost materials. We haven't seen an increase in hold times. So from this qualitative perspective, looking at it, everything generally seems to be positive. On a quantitative level, especially on a cost level, we knew that there was going to be a decrease in the collection of library fines. I had speculated it would be somewhere on the order of little less than $1,000 a month, and more or less that's what it's been, probably closer to $600 or $700 a month. But as I also pointed out to you at the time, library fines have never been super substantial in any case. As an offset to overall library expenses, they've never been more than 2%, and now they're substantially less than that. There's also an interesting curveball to this. So at the exact same time, April of 2019, that we started no longer collecting overdue fines for youth materials, CCRLS, Chemeketa Cooperative Regional Library Service, instituted a cooperative-wide new policy that overlaps with our fine collection scheme in an interesting way. We turned on a feature that was always available, but we didn't take advantage of until April 1st, where if you borrow a book, let's say you borrow a copy of Harry Potter, and you forget to renew that, prior to last April, you would get an overdue notice warning you, hey, several days ago you were supposed to return this item to us. You never did, and for your trouble, we've been charging you 25 cents a day in overdues as an incentive to get that book back to us. As of last April, what we now do whenever possible, and this is all managed by the integrated library system, materials renew automatically. And so there's a bit of a decision tree about 4 days in advance. The system looks at every given item. If it can renew that item, it does so. It sends an email out to the borrower saying, hey, your item's been renewed. This is your new date. If it's not able to renew an item because it's reached a maximum number of renewals, let's say, or maybe that item's on hold for somebody else, at that 4-day point, it'll warn you, hey, we tried to renew it, we couldn't. Please make sure you have the book back within the 4 days. The result of that change is twofold. One, it increases our circulation data, because every time an item is renewed, that counts as an additional circulation. So that looks good for us in terms of materials borrowing. And that actually reflects real usage, so it's not just a contrived number because folks are keeping items longer. Parenthetically, one of the disincentives to going to an automatic renewal system is if you have folks that are used to browsing materials on the shelf and items are renewed because people don't have to return them as quickly, generally there's fewer items on the shelf to browse, and so that's why maybe you wouldn't go with this system. We did. The other significant impact is all these materials that are renewing, and it's thousands and thousands every month. Our renewal of materials more than doubled. Let's say from a little under 3,000 renewed items a month to generally about 6,000 renewed items every month. Those aren't collecting those little 25-cent, 50-cent, 75-cent fees. So as an example, in 2019, our fine revenue was $10,400 for the whole fiscal year. That was down from, say, 2016 when it was $14,700. This year, I think I went through February, so for the first 2/3 of the fiscal year, we've collected $1,951. How much of that is due to automatic renewals? I can't really say. How much of that is due to the fact that we're just not assessing overdue fines for youth materials? It's impossible to discern. Unfortunately, we collect our fines and fees in aggregate. But the reality is, let's say we decided to revert and go back to charging, youth overdue fines, probably because of overdue or automatic renewal. We're not going to collect very much fines and fees, and so it becomes a little bit of a moot point, especially because the offset isn't super significant. So after I presented all of this information to the library board last January, they expressed an opinion and passed a motion urging the city council to not only make the waiving of and not charging of overdue fines on youth materials permanent, but also to extend this policy of not charging overdue fines to basically the collection. There would be a couple exceptions, museum passes, where there is an incentive really to want folks to get those passes back quickly. We would probably still charge overdues on those, but basically anything that's on the shelf for the intended purpose of being borrowed and used would no longer assess an overdue fee if that item is returned late. There are still fees for lost materials, damaged materials. Kids can work those off over time if they become a burden. We have a reading for fines policy. But generally, we would not charge overdue fines, period, for the vast majority of the items in the collection.
Questions or comments?
I have a question. How do you determine if you have, if you're going to enact this policy, how do you determine that you have an item that is lost or unavailable to another user?
Excellent question. We have a process whereby on a fairly regular basis, if an item isn't returned or it doesn't show up as having an on-shelf status, the system will actually code that. Eventually a report will be generated and a person will actually go out and try and find that item on the shelf. And if it's not found, then
How about if it's in my closet and I haven't returned it?
Well, then it'll get marked lost. Often folks will come in and say, hey, I know for a fact I returned this item. And That's always an interesting conversation because we can't, prove to them 100%, hey, we never got it back. But you'd be surprised how often somebody will come back 9 months to a year later and, oops, it turns out I really did have it.
But you don't normally automatically replace it.
It depends on how current that item is and how popular it is. If it's something that's maybe 10, 15 years old, chances are we won't replace it. If it's something that's maybe 6 months, 9 months old, and there's still a long wait list for it, we'll replace it. We'll buy another copy.
Thank you.
Sure.
Mr. Mayor, I
Yes,
have
Mr. Morse?
two questions. So when the library board and you were talking about this, how did you guys plan to offset the revenue loss? About 10 grand, 9,600 or whatever you said?
It basically wouldn't be offset. That revenue would no longer come into the city.
So my conundrum is, if Eric from the Public Works came up and said, hey, we provide water to the city, we provide water to the residents, and when residents don't pay, there's a late fee structure, and we waive that, and we say we're not gonna do that anymore. Obviously, that's a huge different dollar amount, but it's still the same concept that if people don't follow the rules and policies and they're penalized for it, then ultimately the other taxpayers within the municipality are responsible for it.
Right.
So I would expect that there would be some problem solving behind that from your shop to figure that piece of it out. I mean, it sounds really warm and fuzzy, and I understand the thoughts behind it, but if we just say, because they're recommending, hey, we'll waive all fines, and maybe that's the trend in society, but it doesn't seem like, and the numbers are kind of cooked from what I understood, the way you were talking about. It's a little hard to track the statistics on it. We'd probably work that out if we got a pen and paper to it, but to me, it doesn't feel like, if people are borrowing something from the city, and that's where we have to look at it, and they're not bringing it back, there should be consequences. Because I'm a big consequences kind of guy. So
Yeah.
that's my thought. And then the other question I had was, what do you think about this personally, as the head of the library, not what the library board thinks or anything else?
Yeah. And that concern that you expressed a year ago, most of the research tends to indicate concern is eventually getting the item back. And as I mentioned, for those items where they are eventually not returned, patrons are billed for those. We work to, traditionally in the past, we used to just basically bill what we paid, whatever the cover price was on a particular book. Because we have access to Amazon and discount purchasing, we generally work with patrons to try and charge them the least amount of money we can and still, replace a given item that we're invested in replacing. So there is a limit on what folks could potentially do as far as, going down the wrong path. And if an item's missing, generally the value is sufficient that it prevents them from borrowing any further until they figure out what they're going to do in terms of replacing that item. So there are still consequences. But again, our concern is we're 23.7% poverty rate, I'm pretty sure. We are underutilized as a resource. Woodburn Public Library is for a community our size. And this gets to your second question, my primary motivation is making the library as accessible as it possibly can be in an environment where there are so many challenges and so many external pressures incentivizing folks not to come to the library. And getting rid of these overdues seems like the best way to do it.
So you're for it?
Yeah, definitely.
Okay, thank you.
Sure.
Questions? Mine is.
I have to admit that I come down pretty much on the side of Councilor Morris. where I think there should be consequences for this kind of behavior.
The first time you presented, you talked about like the national trends or just maybe statewide trends in libraries. Could you speak to that again about? this issue?
Yeah, most of our larger metropolitan systems are doing away with overdue fines. Los Angeles County was the biggest system then a year ago. Subsequently, the vastly superior, my former employer at the Los Angeles Public Library, the city library, has done away with overdue fines. The American Library Association lists promoting the removal of all barriers to library and information services, particularly fees and overdue charges, in first place as a means of facilitating library services to the poor. Salem Public Library was going to try and implement an overdue fine-free policy. And then with their building modifications, they've moved out for 2 years now. There were other more pressing issues that came to the front of Salem Public Library's agenda. So we will basically be in the lead in terms of Polk, Yamhill, and Marion counties on elimination of overdue fines. But I want to say Clackamas County has already done this in entirety, and more large systems across the country are doing so. It's basically now perceived as best practice within the library profession.
All right, well, I never miss a chance to invoke the memory of my dear mother, who was a librarian and worked at the Salem Public Library on the weekends, and little kids would lose their books, and her own grandchildren, my children, would lose their books, probably thanks to their father. So you'd go in and wash the desks a little bit, or you would, work off your fine. But I think she would land on getting more books in the hands of children all the time. So. Thank you, sir.
Mr. Mayor, I make a motion that we discontinue the imposition of library fines for overdue books, magazines, and DVDs in the child, teen, and adult collections, and waive the existing fines for these materials.
I second.
All those in favor?
We're going to talk about it?
No? Further discussion? Sorry.
So my biggest concern is that the question I asked about offsetting the revenue is that it doesn't even deal with the fines. It's the budget itself. Just like the pool or any other thing we run, if they say, hey, we're comfortable taking 10 grand off the plate and not offsetting it in any way, shape, or form, that's a concern for me. Because if I was coming to this meeting, I would have said, well, I just process things different. I would have thought, well, if I'm losing revenue, how am I going to gain it back? Or how am I just going to offset it? Is that shorter hours, which is not popular? Is it limiting services or what? So that's my biggest concern, because if they're short on revenue, we're going to have to get it from somewhere. And I'm sure the chief and everybody else isn't interested in giving up revenue for their departments. So that's, I think, the question we have to ask ourselves here, and we'll ask ourselves in a few months at the budget hearing. So that's my biggest concern. Paying library fines, I paid them. I'd like to get a refund if that's possible as part of this policy. I mean, I think they all $3 of it, but which were not mine, they were my family's. But that's my biggest concern. If we're just, anything we run should, within reason, support itself. I mean, it's already a chunk of money, so that's my concern.
I think Councilor Morris makes a very powerful point regarding budget integrity. And, we councilors actually have a fiduciary responsibility regarding the city. No matter what the dollar value is, it's something we have to look at.
When I looked at the agenda packet, that's the same thing I thought too. That's $10,000 that we won't have to buy new books or whatever could be, back in the library coffers.
So how has it been in the last year? I mean, almost $10,000. Is that, how have you managed to?
Thanks for the question. I'm proud of the fact that over the past 10 years that I've been running the library, we have run substantially under budget every year. I think in the last fiscal year, there was $20,000 remaining in the library budget. The year before that was closer to $30,000. So we try and operate as efficiently as we possibly can, and hopefully that helps to mitigate any potential offset that or decrease that we would see in those offsetting revenues.
And I completely, I agree with what you're saying, but if he's the one that's been seeing this and has done it, and if other libraries are doing it and it's been working for them, for our community, I mean, I don't see why not.
Excuse me.
Sure.
Thank you. John, I noticed that you said that in that fine revenue, it was for photocopies and other things, so you'll still be able to have a balance. You'll be collecting fees for those.
Exactly.
And there's no way that you can separate how much was for overdue books or how much was collected for, like you say, photocopies and the other things.
Lost materials,
Yes, all of that.
replacement library cards, right, exactly. We have traditionally aggregated those amounts. We could separate them out. I think that would, require more account lines.
Sure.
Let me offer a slightly different way to potentially look at this. The library is a warm, fuzzy institution. We're supposed to be doing good in the community, while also facilitating youth literacy, especially language acquisition, cultural inclusion, providing folks access to materials that perhaps they couldn't otherwise afford, and encouraging civic engagement. I read it was actually a reflection in my daily devotional where somebody was making the point that reading encourages empathy, because in reading novels especially, you learn to see things from the perspective of the other. And in doing so, you're, hopefully creating a more peaceful world, more empathetic world. Those kinds of things are hard to quantify in terms of their value. But if I look at the number of books that we have on the shelf, the library is a relatively expensive program in that we add about 4,000 items every year. We have staff that catalog them. We have folks that develop and implement programs for mostly qualitative purposes. For the amount that we're spending, I'll go back to a point I made earlier. I feel like we are underutilized in terms of our population. So you could almost argue by saving this, by agreeing to forgo this comparatively small amount of fine revenue, the hope is that overall we'll have a substantially better return on the overall investment through significantly increased usage.
Mr. Mayor, John, remind me, what is your overall fiscal year budget in the current year?
This year is $985,000.
Oh, sure. And if it's helpful for the city council, the library is a lot like our police department in that it is seen as a pure general fund supported type of a service program. It's not a cost recovery center like we treat the aquatic center, which has an actual revenue target of 50% of its operating cost. So the library is considered as a pure policy provided general fund services program to the benefit of the community. Sort of like the police department in that when police show up to your house, you don't get a bill. When when you go into the library, you don't get a bill because of the public benefit that it provides to the community. Traditionally in Woodburn has been seen as a general fund supported program. So it's not a proprietary fund type of service.
So you said 985. So that-
1,000, yeah.
Yeah.
So it's about
It pushes
less
about
than 2%. Was what we're talking
It pushes about $1 million, and I also say too that when the library has also been the recipient of cuts. There were now, John, you've been here as long as I have, or longer, and when we were in an economic downturn, we scaled back operating hours. We've not filled positions. We've held vacancies, and so the library has kind of ebbed and flowed, but it's always been a priority program for the general fund, the best of our ability, because of the benefit it provides to the community.
Yeah, and since 2006, we've actually seen a reduction in 4 FTE. So we are operating significantly more leanly than we have traditionally.
Any other questions or comments? All right. What has been moved and seconded?
Call the question.
Call the question. All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed?
Nay.
Aye.
So I got 3-2. All right, motion carries. Thank you, sir.
Thank you.
Okay, we're going to move to the city administrator's report.
Thank you, Mr. Mayor. I do have something I wanted to bring to your attention tonight. Late this afternoon, we got a public release from Union Pacific saying that they intended to increase train speed through Woodburn from 45 miles an hour to 60 miles an hour for freight traffic on the railroad and 70 miles per hour for passenger service. And so in the past, this is not the first time this has come up. In the past, the city has seen significant public safety concerns associated with increased train speeds through town, particularly in our pedestrian-friendly business district portion of downtown. We're also concerned about children that access the line coming into downtown and going to schools and security associated with that. And we've resisted these efforts in the past. This notice that we received today has created a small flurry of activity in City Hall as we try to track down what the situation is. To the credit of UP, the city was concerned that the city's notice in a press release was short time. We'd like to have more time to consider what this means for Woodburn, and they agreed to extend the implementation of this by 2 weeks as opposed to next week. And then we've also found that there's been some changes made legislatively to this matter since the last time it came up. And it looks as though the feds have granted authority to Oregon, and the legislature has preempted local government's ability in the last high-speed rail plan that was adopted by the legislature for local governments to try to impact that. And so we know that there are other communities along the line that also have concerns. And so this came up this afternoon, and the implications I think are obvious. The police department, primarily responsible for public safety and traffic concerns, and would be first responders to any incident associated with a train, has significant concerns as well. But whether or not the city has any legal mechanism for redress on this is still being looked at pretty hard. But it has changed from the last time this issue came up, and we may not have the same levers that we had before. But I wanted to tell you that I think that will not go over well in this community, and it's probably something that as a local government we're going to hear about, despite the fact that we have no authority or power over Union Pacific.
So they're essentially going to run a train through at freeway speed.
That is true.
Higher than that, no? 70? 75 per hour?
The current speed limit is 45.
No, I think they're already going too fast. And lately, I've been feeling the vibration this week just incredibly more so than, I don't know if there's more weight or.
Well, there are stories of radar and police cars clocking trains above the speed limit, and I could talk anecdotally about that a lot. But this would take the official speed restriction of 45 miles per hour and increase it to 60 for freight and 70 for rail, for passenger rail. And I've seen trains, I believe, traveling at those speeds, maybe even greater occasionally. And, you know, it is unnerving to be standing downtown and have a 65-mile-an-hour freight train go by. It just is unnerving to me personally, and I'm sure other people feel the same way. So we're going to continue to look into this. The next council meeting will still be within the time change UP agreed to for implementation on this. We might be able to provide you more of an update then. But if I do know that the press release went out, it'll likely be in media, and people, I think, will be looking to us to see what we can do to address concerns. And of course, we don't know that there's anything that we can do given some of the legislative changes that have occurred around rail in Oregon. But we're gonna look at it. I've
And is
asked
this
Bob and his
through
team to.
up and down Oregon, or just?
I believe so. There are other communities that have these concerns, and you know, we were able to find some other cities that this is impacting in addition to Woodburn, and sort of coming up with the same conclusions that, you know, their local input have been preempted by the legislature as part of their rail plan for Oregon.
Because we are, like, I mean, thanks to Jesse Sedemeyer, like, who brought the train right through town, like, different even than it can be, or, I mean, where you are right next to our downtown businesses and community college and.
Yeah, well, that's exactly right.
Mr. Mayor, council.
Yes.
I guess historically, more than anecdotally, because historically, when I first started representing the city, I had a case that I tried. And the laws changed. We're looking into the specifics of it. In fact, I was looking at it a little more during the meeting even. But it used to be that the Public Utility Commission had jurisdiction. It's an area where the states always had jurisdiction. Used to be under their procedure when train speed changed, the railroad had to petition. And the case I tried, the city of Woodburn, I think the railroad actually wanted the same thing that they're trying to get this time, and the first time. I tried this case, represented the city, put a bunch of witnesses on, talked about Woodburn Fertilizer, talked about the downtown area, talked about a bunch of concerns, called a bunch of witnesses, and won, and we stopped it. But what has happened here, it looks like, is that undoubtedly the PUC has no more jurisdiction. The state still preempts the area, which they did before, but there's a different procedure. It's now in what they call ODOT rail. And ODOT rail, by virtue of their sort of fast rail approach, you know, is pretty much taking the area over. And I don't think that we have nearly the rights that we had before to ask for an administrative hearing and get one. I mean, I'll tie that down for you. That won't be a problem. I mean, we'll have that answer for you, I mean, well before next council meeting. It's just one of these many areas where the state changes the way that it happens. In this case, mainly sort of to hop onto the fast rail sort of bandwagon, and it looks like the rules have just changed.
I thought the high-speed fast rail was all based around around moving people, not freight.
Well, right, but there's also corridors, like there's one, I'm learning quite a bit, you know, I mean, since this was an area that I had some expertise in when I tried this one case, but things change. And actually, there's even quite a lot of federal authority, but a lot of that goes from the federal government, preempted by the state, and now, like I said, the state's got a completely different process, which, very frankly, I mean, I don't have the details on yet, but it's not looking like municipalities have more authority. It's looking like far less authority than we used to have.
That's why we got the Hardcastle realignment done so quick. Now I see their plan.
Yeah.
Well, it seems to be a connection between projects like that and ODOT implementing, you know, what they can do, ODOT rail.
But I would say there still remains concerns at potentially other intersections in Woodburn. The address of the Settlemire realignment was a critical public safety concern because of the nature of the traffic there. The speed itself presents a different kind of concern. So, and there are different intersections that we would be concerned about with those increased speeds, other than Settlemyre as well.
And of course, I'm not saying, I'm just your attorney, so I'm giving you legal opinion, and where that's at, and you'll have it finalized in the next few days, but that doesn't mean, of course, that City of Woodburn officials can't express their opinion and that they will not be able to influence someone, because there'll be a process to be heard, at least to some degree. I'm just saying that the process that we did have, where in one case, I tried a case all day and we didn't, actually the city won. That process is now gone, so.
And when is the public hearing? When?
I don't know that there is a public hearing. The UP announced the increase effective next week based on the city's immediate response and concern. They unilaterally agreed to extend the implementation date till March 15th, I believe.
So it's advisory. They're advising us that
Well, they had told us they were just going to do it next week, and as though the decisions have already been made, and perhaps they already have.
That's good news.
Yeah. Well, we may want to write a letter or reach out to state officials if we need to, but we do need to do some homework. But I do think.
But it's not a public. They're not going to come and present, and Jimmy Stewart can't come and.
No, I would not expect that to happen. I wish that it would. I chuckle because the railroad's interests are vast, and they're an enormous organization, and so their perspective on this is a lot different than ours. But we'll find out. I do think it will be in the media soon. You're going to hear about it soon, and we're working on it to see what, if anything, we can do to try to deal with it. I think it's fair to say that the city has opposed this historically in the past at different times, and that we have real concerns that we think are valid and should be addressed by Union Pacific to ensure that they can safely transgress our community in a manner that protects our residents and also their trains as well.
Well, the railroad has been in control of themselves for most of America's history.
Yes. Yeah.
Despite Teddy Roosevelt and some people that tried to do something about it.
That's right.
All right.
That's all I have, Mr. Mayor.
Okay. Councilor reports. Councilor Cornwell.
I asked Scott about the Hardcastle Interchange Front Street and how it's not done, in my visual opinion, because there's all that orange cones, there's still a big hole, there's erosion control. It's like they abandoned their project when it was like 85% done or something. I'm just, maybe they think they have to train the lemmings how to go around corners, I don't know. But I think we're adult enough in driving that, and I see people going around that corner where it used to be right turn, you could make it freely. There's no sign saying that, and people are still doing it, so I have a little concern there. But
I've
yeah.
gotten the same feedback. It looks neat on paper, but I think people either can't use common sense or can't wrap their heads around it, but it's kind of a cluster. So as much as I was excited, and I was talking to somebody this evening that's been using the crosswalk down there that was put in, which is super cool, but it sounds like it's just, like playing Frogger, so. Yeah.
And now with the train coming through at 70 miles per hour, it's like,
It's gonna level up,
yeah, it's like a video game now.
professional level.
Does Union Pacific have any more work to do there, or is it?
I don't know if Curtis knows the status of that.
The contractor, the Union Pacific is done, but the contractor still has some finishing work to do with the striping because of the weather, so they have to do that later in the year. So I don't
The
know whether
weather?
there's a-
Yeah, they have to have concrete. It has to be dry when you apply, and it has to stay dry for enough time to cement. And then I think the cones will remain there until the striping is complete. I think you'll find that's probably a safety requirement. Has to do with the Pix Theater as well. I know people are asking about that. We're just waiting for consistent dry weather so that we don't have to reapply striping.
Well, if I could just jump in just to add to that conversation. It was one of our first meetings when I was mayor, and it was like, it's gonna cost $1 million, no, it's gonna cost $2 million, and that's just a thing that's in my craw, if that's the right expression. So I drive through there, and I'm trying to like decide how much like that piece was, of how much the $2 million was that thing, and how much was the other thing. It's just the price of these things
Yeah, you
continues
drive
to
that
bother
every
me.
day, don't you?
Right. So I get bothered every day when I All right.
Just bottom line, my last little bit is that we live, we grow, we support this town, and we love this town, and you have companies come through and they have toxic behavior that affects our, enjoyability and livability of Woodburn in general. And now we're getting thrown with the railroad that we tolerate, and they're gonna make it even worse for us. And it's just, they don't get it. Sure, they don't live here, but it doesn't mean that they have the right to come through and make our lives even, not as tolerable because of them already. But it's just pitiful. So.
Councilor Corvallis?
Well, I wanted to invite the council on Friday, March 13th, from 4 to 8 for International Women's Day celebration at Becun. There's going to be like an art installation, and we're going to hand out 2 awards. So y'all are more than welcome to come.
What's the time
March
again?
what?
It's March 13th.
13th.
At 4 you can see the installation, but the program starts from 5:30 to 8.
Okay.
And I can send Heather. I can send you the email, and then you can send it to all the city
Should be
council
an
members.
e-blast.
Yeah.
I have a note on here, that's
It's
the
on
Chamber
the
of
invite
Commerce
only.
Awards night.
So you can do both.
You have what?
Chamber of Commerce Awards night.
Oh, okay.
But you can do both. You can go to International Women's Day and come to the Chamber of Commerce event.
Oh,
Grady?
nothing to contribute tonight, thank you.
Councilor Morse?
I have nothing, thank you.
I just have a few things. It's been a busy week with community center doing, so shout out to Jim and to Scott. We met both with the YMCA director about their possible involvement in perhaps the funding, and then also the running of a facility in the future connected to our community center, or part of that. And then with the mayor of Independence, who's done lots of community development in downtown Independence, if you've been there, all kinds of great things. And he also works for Lynn Benton Community College as a fundraiser, and got his input about funding the community center from private and nonprofit and foundation. So those were all very informational meetings. And today, same with the update, our state representative called and is in negotiations with the Speaker of the House and the Senate President for a request of state lottery funds for that. So, and that seemed to look promising at this point. Shout out to the firefighters. I attended the firefighters banquet, and one Saturday, and then just last Saturday, the CERT team, and then just before this meeting, as I mentioned, I went to the first class of the CERT trainings, and there were 20 people there, and that it had an impact on me, just learning more about that. Here's a group of our citizens who are going through quite a bit of training, it's like a class, like 30 hours or 25 hours of training. And when the big one hits, they're going to be the people that are connected to our police department and to our fire department. As they're doing all those kinds of things, this group of people is being trained to help their neighbors and to work and to be a support to our police and fire and ambulance system. So, and attended the warming shelter training and learned more about that. And then yet to reiterate, Councilor Carney, March 13th, you're invited to the Distinguished Service Awards after the International Women's Day. I think that starts at 6:30 or 7. And I also spoke, of course, the best thing I did in the last 2 weeks, I spoke to about 120 North Marion second graders and then fourth graders. And the fourth graders are doing BizTown, and they're about to have an election for mayor of BizTown at North Marion Intermediate School. So
You running?
yeah, I don't have a very good chance. Seem to be some smart kids in that group. So, and speaking of the future and young people, I just want to thank again True Pearson for sitting through this meeting
And staying awake.
and staying awake. And I think she would have voted with the majority for the no fines for youth materials. So I'm glad you were here. Thank you for being here. All right, entertain a motion to adjourn.
So moved.
So moved.
Second?
Second.
All those in favor?
Aye.
Opposed? Motion carries. We are adjourned.